Thanks so much. I'm Toby Graham. I'm director of the Harvard Rare Book and Manuscript Library and deputy university librarian. And on behalf of the Harvard Library and of the University of Georgia Libraries, of which it is a part, I'd like to welcome all of you to the 10th annual Georgia Writers Hall of Fame induction ceremony. Today we celebrate the lives and works of writers Melissa Fay Green, Natasha Trethewey, and the late James Patrick Kilgo. We pay tribute to the creative heritage of our state by honoring posthumously songwriter Johnny Mercer. They're among the 43 writers inducted since the University of Georgia Libraries established the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame in 2000. The Harvard Library, which administers the program, is the leading rare book and manuscript repository on Georgia history and culture, and it includes the Georgiana collection, the most extensive assemblage of writings by Georgians and on Georgia. And the Harvard also holds more than 6 million original documents, including papers related to literary figures such as Margaret Mitchell, Erskine Caldwell, Byron Herbert Reese, Cora Harris, Lillian Smith, Calder Willingham, Harry Cruz, Judith Ortiz Cofer, Philip Lee Williams, and others. And I'm extraordinarily pleased today to announce to you that the Kilgo family has decided to add to this list the papers of Dr. James Kilgo. Thank you so much. We're also very excited that by the fall of this year, we will be moving into a new Special Collections Library building on Hull Street, very close to this site, and it will provide a much expanded home for the Harvard Library and also for the Walter J. Brown Media Archives and Peabody Awards Collection and the Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies. And we look forward to hosting the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame events at the new library next year. I need to express the library's deep gratitude to George and Nancy Montgomery, whose love of literature and philanthropic spirit led them to create an endowment for the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame that will ensure that we are able to recognize the literary talent of Georgians for many years to come. I'd like to thank Mary Adams, the First Lady of our university, for being with us today, and she has been with the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame since its inception, and we thank you very much for your presence. I also would like to recognize Dr. Bill Potter, sitting back here in the corner discreetly, who guides the libraries and all that we do with a combination of vision, creativity, and sound judgment. I'd like to thank the following UGA Library staff for their work on behalf of the Hall of Fame: Mary Ellen Brooks, Chantel Dunham, Skip Hewlett, Leandra Nessel, Debbie Dove, Mackenzie Herring, and Jean Cleveland. The Writers Hall of Fame relies on a distinguished panel of judges to determine which authors are inducted, and I would like to take a moment to recognize them. And as I call your names, if you will raise your hand or wave or otherwise draw attention to yourself. Mary Adams, Stephen Corey, Peggy Gallus, Julie Hunt, John Insco. Where is John? Nicole Mitchell, Bill Potter, Hugh Rubersberg, Lisa White, Phil Williams, Jane Wilson, Jamil Zinaldine, and not in attendance with us, but also on the board of judges, Coleman Barks, David Bottoms, Judith Ortiz Cofer, Shell Knox, and Sidney Samuel Thomas. And finally, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our newest inductees and their family and friends: Natasha Trethewey, Melissa Fay Green, Jane Kilgo, and all the members of the Kilgo family that are here with us today, and the family of Johnny Mercer, including James Corwin and Nancy Gerard. And now is Dr. Insco, has he arrived yet? Okay. So at this point, I would like to introduce, hopefully he will be here shortly. I'd like to introduce Philip Lee Williams, who himself was inducted into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame in 2010, and he will be, and Ms. Jane Kilgo will accept on Dr. Kilgo's behalf. So if you would come join us.
Good morning, everybody. Before I begin my formal remarks, welcoming my dear friend Jim Kilgo, one of the finest writers ever to grace this state, into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame, I would like to say that I am personally honored today to be in the presence of Melissa Bay Green and Natasha Trepaway, and also of their family and their friends, and also of the family and friends of the late Johnny Mercer. I would also like to take just a moment to recognize Jim's family. He would have been the first to say that without them, he wouldn't have existed as a writer, nor would he have had such a wonderful life as a man. I'm going to ask the following to stand and ask you to hold your applause until the end. First is his beloved wife, Jane. Then his daughter, Sarah Jane, and her daughter. Sarah Jane's husband, Michael, unfortunately can't be with us this morning. Then there's Jim's son, Jim and Jane's son, John, his wife, Susie, and daughter, Caroline. And we also want to mention and recognize Jim and Jane's daughter, Ann, and her husband, Matteo, and their 2 children who live in Italy and were unable to be with us today. And finally, there's a large contingent of Kilgo relatives here, too. Enough to make this a preview of the barbecue Jim will be throwing for them all when they get to heaven. So I'd like to ask all of you who are related to Jim to stand, too. Let's give them all a round of applause. In 1970, I began dating an English major here at the University of Georgia, and she kept telling me about this extraordinary professor she had. His knowledge of the material, his passion for teaching, and the intensity of his joy in literature were life-changing. I asked that girl last weekend if she felt the same way now. And Linda, my wife for almost 39 years now, said he was the best professor that she ever had. Indeed, he changed her life. Because of Jim Kilgo, she made English literature her life's work. At the time, she called him Mr. Kilgo because Jim hadn't quite finished his PhD at Tulane while he was already teaching here in Athens. I was only minoring in English and history and majoring in journalism because I had a sense that fiction and poetry probably wouldn't keep bread on my table for a lifetime. But when time came for graduate school, I did become an English major, and I took a class from Dr. Kilgo. And indeed, as Linda said, he was magnificent in the classroom. This certainly wasn't a secret. Jim was highly honored for his teaching, and his students were vocal about how much they loved him. And yet, for reasons that he himself may never have quite understood, he simply had no interest in scholarly writing. He tried it, of course, but it left him cold. Flash forward 7 years. I'd gotten severely injured working at the University of Georgia bookstore during grad school in an accident that was completely my own fault. And having no money, I had to go back to work in journalism. Linda and I both dropped out of grad school, and I went back to my hometown of Madison, Georgia to work for the local newspaper. Linda would later earn her master's degree, but I never did because I found that being a journalist was an exciting and congenial profession. Working with words every day as an editor and a newspaper writer also paralleled my unfolding life as a creative writer. I was fortunate enough in 1978 to get a job as editor of a very fine alternative newspaper here in Athens called the Athens Observer. One day in the early 1980s, I believe, I looked up and there standing before my desk was Dr. Kilgo, as I still knew him, looking very youthful and holding several sheets of paper. He had written, he said, a number of hunting essays and wondered if I would like to publish them. Hunting essays, I said. Well, hunting and other things, he said. I told him I'd be glad to take a look, since the Observer prided itself on publishing many different kinds of opinions, left, center, and right. We shook hands, and I set it aside in a huge stack of things that other people had submitted. It was only early the following morning when I began to read it, and I was stunned. He was writing about hunting and the outdoors, but with a voice and craft, with genuine art in a way I'd never read before. Would I publish Jim's work? You bet I would. And I did. Each time Jim came by with another column was cause for celebration by everyone on the staff. And the reaction from the public was uniformly, and I might say ecstatically positive. And when you realize that few of our regular readers were hunters or even knew much about the natural world, Jim's achievement becomes much clearer. Jim was a slow worker. He agreed with Flaubert and Le Mot Juste, and he simply would not let an essay go until it was perfect. During the years from his first column until 1988, Jim and I became friends. At first, we were simply editor and writer, though calling myself his editor is misleading because it implies he needed one. He didn't. I rarely touched a word the man wrote. But over the years, as I got to know Jim, we became good friends and then very close ones. Jim was a man who made an art of friendship, and though to him I was one of many, our relationship was perhaps slightly different from others because of our shared writing. Then everything changed. In 1988, Jim published his first book of nature essays, Deep Enough for Ivory Bills, with Algonquin Books, complete with gorgeous pen and ink drawings that he executed himself. Suddenly, The Professor Who Didn't Write became a national sensation. His book received a rapturous review in the New York Times. He had found his voice, and what a voice it is. Those of us who knew and loved Jim shared his success. I will never forget the look of stunned, joyous disbelief on his face as he looked at the huge crowd gathered to honor him at the legendary Old Black Dog bookstore on South Lumpkin Street here in Athens. Though Jim and I remained close friends until his death, and through the writing and publication of his other brilliant books, I like to remember him that evening at the Old Black Dog, a man wholly in charge of an art he was born to create. One of my favorite essays in Ivory Bills is about the death of a hunting and fishing friend he calls Jack Bass in the book. Jack's sudden and unexpected death hit everyone around him hard, and Jim, in trying to express his own feelings, spoke for many, but in words only an artist could find. This is what Jim wrote. I went up to Jack's farm after the funeral. I thought I might do a little fishing. It had been hot at the cemetery, but the evening was growing cool by the time I got to the pond. August burning low, as Emily Dickinson puts it. The sun was a red ball in a grainy sky, the foliage around the pond frayed and dull. 2 boats rocked gently in their berths in the boathouse, cobwebbed in the corners as though they had not been used all summer. That was not true, of course. I had fished in one of them in July. Both were metal, big and wide, unwieldy as bathtubs, and the rear seats in both, where Jack was used to sitting, were badly bent in the middle. For no particular reason, I chose the boat on the right. A breeze took me as soon as I cleared the berth, a steady breeze angling across the open water from the east, flaking the surface with light. I opened the rod case and removed the red satin sleeve, untied it, and pulled it back from the glistening sections of graphite rod. The wind was blowing me back toward the boathouse, so I laid the rod aside and paddled toward the middle of the pond. Instead of fishing, though, Jim paddles far out into the lake, only to find himself trapped by a rising thunderstorm. Earlier, he had explained how he felt Jack's presence still alive on the pond, even after Jack's funeral. So he began to stroke back toward the berth, and this is how he described that. When I was halfway across, the whole pond held its breath and flickered, as though the particles of dust in the air were about to ignite. Then in a thundering crash, they did, blinding me so that I feared I was dead. When the last echoes of thunder died away, I heard Jack's laughter again and looked up to see him still against the rail, indifferent to my plight. I was furious, almost to the point of tears. How could he not know, I thought, that I might never make it in? And I longed for him to turn, if only to share my terror. But not until I reached the boathouse did I see his face. No one but Jim could deal with loss so beautifully, with the rough tenderness male friends spend their lives working through and sometimes around. If Jim Kilgo was sensitive to the landscape of the South, and he was, supremely so, he was even more sensitive to the web of human relationships of which we are all a part. He came by it honestly, as we say in these parts. Here are the bare facts of one man's life. The son of John and Caroline Kilgo, Jim was born and grew up in Darlington, South Carolina. He received his undergraduate degree from Wofford College in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and earned MA and PhDs in English from Tulane. Jim joined the faculty at UGA in 1967, where he received 5 outstanding honors professor awards and the Honoratus Award for Excellence in Teaching. He directed the creative writing program from 1994 to 1996 and retired from teaching in 1999. After Deep Enough for Ivory Bills, he published another book of essays called Inheritance of Horses, a novel, Daughter of My People, a lovely seasonal title called The Hand-Carved Creche and Other Christmas Memories. And in between, he found time to write the text of a photo book called The Blue Wall, Wilderness of the Carolinas in Georgia. His last book, published after his death, was a collaborative effort called Ossabaw, Avocations of an Island. Jim loved to fish and hunt, though in his later years, he no longer felt a real need to hunt. He loved the great waters of the world, especially the South, whether it was a trickling creek or a vast ocean. And you have already met part of his large and loving family. All these books are wonderful, the insightful work of a man who saw his writing as an extension of his teaching. But along with Ivory Bills, most believe that his other major work was Daughter of My People. It is a work that astonished me when I read the bound galley proofs in 1998. As the promotional copy explains, at the center of the story are 2 brothers, Hart and Tyson Bonner, and their cousin Jenny Grant, a mixed-race woman one brother loves and the other dishonors. Theirs is a world in which dark passions lead to tragic consequences. Daughter of My People was based on real events that Jim knew well, and unraveling the complexities of the story as he wrote the novel based on these events was an obvious joy to Jim. Here's how the New Georgia Encyclopedia describes this novel. In this novel, Kilgo explores the deep paradoxes and ironies of the heritage of race in the South and of the United States, a history whose very divisions are built on connections and kinship. In a world of racial bigotry, cruelty, and a family struggle, Kilgo creates in Jenny a character who defies human categories. He describes her in a way that emphasizes the meaninglessness of racial divisions. In recognition for this book, Kilgo received the Townsend Prize for Fiction in 1998. In conversations with other writer friends, I sometimes said I believe that Jim might have written more fiction had he lived to do so. And yet when I asked him about it, he looked puzzled. I don't understand at all how someone like you just thinks something up and writes a novel about it, he said. For me, it has to be personal. There has to be some kind of real personal involvement with what I'm writing. Jim's last book that he was working on at his death was called Colors of Africa and was the result of a lifelong dream we had talked about many times. Both of us were admirers of Hemingway's book Green Hills of Africa, though for different reasons. And Jim also loved Isaac Dennison and her book Out of Africa. But while I was and have remained largely a mental traveler, as Blake called armchair dreamers, Jim journeyed to Africa and wrote about it. I think that book, whose finished version he didn't live to see, was deeply important to him on many levels. It was in many ways his summa, the best explanation for his love of landscape and the animals and people who walk through it. And it was a deep and moving explanation of his own necessity for loving the earth. During the years I knew Jim, we talked often about the frustrations of writing, of getting it just right. But there were 2 other things he talked about all the time, and I think I should mention them this morning upon his induction into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. One was his Christian faith, which gave him peace and that he shared with many along the way, especially in the last 10 years of his life, after being diagnosed with a cancer that, combined with other ailments, finally took him from us. The other was his family. I suspect most of us put our families at the center of our lives, but Jim was just hopelessly in love with his. He talked about his children and about Jane all the time. If you said, "How's the writing going?" he would give you 5 minutes of the kind of moaning and groaning all writers know and share. But if you ask, "How is your family?" he'd finish talking half an hour later, and even then, usually only when someone interrupted him. Often, when confronted with the lives of creative people, we are asked to forgive their many human flaws because of their literary accomplishments. And of course, Jim had his flaws, as every single one of us does. But if there were a Friends Hall of Fame, a Fond Fathers Hall of Fame, or a Family Lover Hall of Fame, Jim Kilgo, by God, would be in the inaugural class. You probably know about Jim, the writer and artist, but if you never knew the man, I wanted you to know that. I believe this with all my heart, just as I believe, as I know, that Jim's work will last and his name will be held high among all those who write or who have written about the world of our daily lives here in the American South. One of Jim's very favorite books, one we talked about often many years before it became a movie, was A River Runs Through It by Norman Maclean. I think its justly famous ending is a good place to sum up not just who Jim was, but who he will remain for all who love fine writing about what he knew to be God's green earth. Every time I read it, I think of Jim. And now that he is gone, the resonance of the words, always profound, becomes intensely personal as well. Here's what Maclean wrote as an old man, and if you listen closely, you can almost hear Jim Kilgo reciting these words, as he often did, knowing they were also his. Now nearly all those I loved and did not understand when I was young are dead, but I still reach out to them. Of course, now I am too old to be much of a fisherman, and now, of course, I usually fish the big waters alone, although some friends think I shouldn't. Like many fly fishermen in western Montana, where the summer days are almost Arctic in length, I often do not start fishing until the cool of the evening. Then, in the Arctic half-light of the canyon, all existence fades to a being with my soul and memories and the sound of the big Blackfoot River and a 4-count rhythm and the hope that a fish will rise. Eventually, all things merge into one and a river runs through it. The river was cut by the world's great flood and runs over rocks from the basement of time. On some of the rocks are timeless raindrops. Under the rocks are the words, and some of the words are theirs. I am haunted by waters. It is a great honor for me to present to you a superb writer, a deeply good man, and now a member of the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame, James Patrick Kilgo.
I really wasn't going to cry, and I'm still not. But after Phil's remarks, it's hard. On behalf of the whole Kilgo family, excuse me, I gratefully accept this honoring of my late husband and best friend, Jim Kilgo. We are truly thrilled with this recognition of his gifts as a writer by his adopted state. He always thought of himself as a South Carolina boy, but over the years he grew to really love Georgia as home. What an amazing company for him to now be in with all the former and current members of this august body here. All of these folks behind, and here are two, and then Donnie Mercer. We also want to thank the University of Georgia Library, Dr. Bill Potter, and especially Toby Graham from the Harvard Library for their interest in obtaining Jim's literary papers and for their patience in our getting them together and in order to be turned over to the library in due time. Jim was a perfectionist, as Phil said in his writing, but in his organizing his papers, not so much. So we're still working on that. And to have them preserved and protected in this wonderful building that's under construction, well under construction now. And I hope those of you who are here from out of town will go by and see the new Special Collections building. It's going to be amazing. Toby sat with John, our son John, and our son-in-law Mateo in the summer and showed us the whole plans, all the plans of what the library is going to look like and where Jim's work and those of so many other writers and other kinds of collections will be. So it's a real honor for his work, Jim's work, to be in that facility. Several people have observed that it seemed that at the beginning of Jim's early writing career, he was moving from perceived confines of home and family out to the woods and fields, discovering himself and the larger world. As his life and writing progressed, he seemed to be moving back to the fields, to a fuller and richer understanding of home, family, faith, and tradition. When that observation was shared with him by several, he did agree, but he did say that he was not really aware that that was happening. He wasn't conscious, or it was not an intentional movement as he was doing his writing. Because of so much of Jim's writings was personal narrative, telling his own experiences mainly in the natural world, many people felt as if they really knew Jim personally. He was transparent and conversational, in person and in his writing. He often had the experience of meeting a reader of his books whom he never really knew before. But that person would speak to him as if they were really old friends in a very familiar manner. That even happened to me on several different occasions, and it still does, and to our children and to some of his friends, because he did write about friends and family. However, I think it's the universal appeal of his themes that have touched people and made stories memorable and significant as his readers personalize them, applying the truths revealed to their own lives. Jim was a consummate storyteller, orally and in writing, coming from a family heritage rich in that tradition. He believed that one of the most effective ways of communicating and revealing truth was in the telling of a story, as Jesus did, through parables, as in the Good Samaritan, revealing who our neighbor really is. I received a letter recently from a cardiologist in Spartanburg, South Carolina, who is an avid admirer of Jim's writing, but whom we did not know, though he grew up here in Athens. He was regretting that he couldn't be present at this event, but he went on at length to praise the value of Jim's work in his own life, saying this: "When I read Inheritance of Horses, I was reminded of the importance of family and male friendships. I hope to entrust my children with an appreciation of the value of friendship, a respect for history and family, and an understanding of the importance of tradition. I gained a greater understanding of the importance of all through my reading of the works of Mr. Kilgo." Y'all excuse me, it's allergy season in Athens. I'm not crying. I'm pleased to be able to announce that Deep Enough for Ivory Bells, his first book, is soon to be published in Italian. Jim's work is now moving forward in Europe. The genre known here as nature writing is known in Europe as wilderness writing, and it's fairly new and unfamiliar there. Ivory Bells was submitted for publication by our Italian son-in-law, Matteo Maschiari, who met and married our daughter Anne after Jim died. Matteo also is a wilderness writer and a professor. A publisher who is working to get wilderness and nature writing more into the mainstream for Italian readers was very interested in Ivory Bells and has accepted it, expecting that its publication can further that process in Italy and abroad. Another amazing example to us as family of the influence of Jim's writing being spread abroad can be seen in the life of a new family friend from Harare, Zimbabwe, whom we've come to know only since Jim died. She and her husband received Jim's last book, Colors of Africa, which came out 2 months after his death, as Phil said, as a gift from an Athens man with whom they do business. This gift came during one of the very worst times in the awful political and social upheavals in Zimbabwe in recent years under Mugabe's ruthless dictatorship. The wife, Elena, has told me many times since we first met in 2004 and on several subsequent visits to Athens that the book literally saved her sanity and her family at a time when she was really about to leave because of the dangers around them under Mugabe's regime. Since they could no longer enjoy the beloved beauty of the bush outside their town and beyond, and were virtual prisoners in their own home, she would read and reread Jim's book and be transported to the serenity of the countryside by the lyrical descriptions, reminding her how very much she loved Africa, her beloved homeland, and would never want to leave it permanently. Each time she comes over here on business, she brings a gift for every one of our family members, including the children that have come along, the new grandchildren, year after year. Well, there are 5 of them now, and Jim only knew one, and then one was a month old. Marion was a month old when Jim died, so he was there when she was born. He did know Caroline. She brings gifts for all of us as an ongoing expression of her appreciation of his life and work. It's been so gratifying to me and to our children to continue to meet people who pay tribute to Jim's gift to inspire others to seek excellence in writing and be discriminating readers. We have heard many times over the years how hearing Jim Kilgo read poetry and prose aloud and talking passionately about literature had transformed their thinking. A number of his creative writing students are now published writers themselves, and many of his students through the years are now teaching at all levels, inspiring others, young and old, and passing on a love for the written word. Several of his graduate students actually are here today. I just met 2 that are here from Minnesota, I think they said. 3 others, one from Macon, one from Athens now, and one from Sewanee. They're teachers in college, are here. And it's so exciting to know that they're with us here today. It's truly heartwarming for those of us who knew and loved Jim Kilgo, that his legacy lives on in so many ways. Again, thank you very much.
Dr. Glenn Eskew is Associate Professor and Director of Undergraduate Studies in History at Georgia State University, and he is author of a biography on Johnny Mercer, which will soon be published by the University of Georgia Press. Johnny's Mercer grandson, James Corwin, will accept on behalf of the Mercer family. So Dr. Eskew, will you join us? Thank you.
And I'll follow Phil's example, if I may, for just a second and indulge you by introducing Johnny's relatives who are here, beginning with his niece, Nancy Mercer Keefe Gerard, and her husband, Steve, and then Jim Corwin, his grandson, will come up. In a lyric, Johnny Mercer wrote, "Any place I hang my hat is home," and as an entertainer caught up in the southern diaspora, he roamed far and wide, living on the east and west coasts, and by the 1960s as a global citizen in London and Paris. But his true compass always pointed towards his birthplace of Savannah, Georgia. Born in 1909, John Herndon Mercer tapped the hybridity of his native multiracial culture to craft jazz interpenetrated popular song, writing nearly 1,500 lyrics by his death in 1976. Most people recognize Mercer's songs. They've heard such movie music as Hooray for Hollywood, P.S. I Love You, You Must Have Been a Beautiful Baby, such torch songs as I Want to Be Around, I Remember You, jazz standards Tangerine, Satin Doll, great American songs Skylark, Dream, I'm Old Fashioned. Of his record-setting 18 nominations for the Academy Award, he set another record when 4 received Oscars for Best Original Song on the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe, and the Cool, Cool, Cool of the Evening, Moon River, and Days of Wine and Roses. Mercer's songs appeared regularly on your hit parade from the 1930s through the 1960s, setting a record when 14 hit the #1 spot. Mercer collaborated with such great composers as Jerome Kern, Harry Warren, and Duke Ellington, writing songs for such stars as Bing Crosby, Judy Garland, Fred Astaire, Rosemary Clooney, and Tony Bennett. He worked with such leading jazz musicians as Louis Armstrong, for whom he wrote Jeepers Creepers, Jimmy and Tommy Dorsey, and fellow Georgian Harry James, with whom he starred on a radio show along with Dinah Shore. Ella Fitzgerald selected Mercer as the only lyricist featured with an album in her songbook series. As a co-founder of Capitol Records, he recruited and oversaw recording sessions of such new artists as Nat King Cole and Margaret Whiting, while helping to repackage old artists Frank Sinatra and Peggy Lee. A regular guest star on radio and television shows, Mercer remained a prominent figure in the entertainment industry. A cursory review of Johnny's ancestry suggests little that points to the stellar career in entertainment that awaited this blue-blooded descendant of the Southern aristocracy. Hugh Mercer, a Scottish refugee from the Battle of Culloden, immigrated to America, befriended George Washington, and served as a brigadier general in the Continental Army, falling to the Redcoats at the Battle of Princeton. Johnny venerated this illustrious ancestor, writing a hit song he sang with the Paul Whiteman Band called Here Come the British, Bang Bang. General Mercer's son married into the Griffin family, thereby bequeathing to Johnny lineal descent from Mary Queen of Scots and a signer of the Declaration of Independence. His eldest son, Hugh Wheaton Mercer, attended West Point, befriended Robert E. Lee, and served in Savannah, where he married the local banker's daughter, Mary Sykes Anderson, the niece of the Savannah mayor, Richard Wayne, and the U.S. Supreme Court Justice James M. Wayne. Their son, George Anderson Mercer, attended Princeton and practiced law in the port town. Both father and son joined the Confederate Army, fighting with distinction in the Atlanta campaign, with Hugh reaching the rank of brigadier general. Yet the stories Johnny heard of the retreating rebels probably provided the source material for his mocking lyrics about the Confederate general who led us safely to the rear in the song Jubilation T. Cornpone from the musical Little Abner. With defeat, General Mercer lost his unfinished mansion, the famed Mercer House in Monterey Square, and moved to Baden-Baden, Germany, where George remained in Savannah, raising a family that included his eldest, G.A. Mercer, who attended the University of Georgia and then joined the law practice back home. Young G.A. speculated in real estate, and when his first wife died, leaving him with 3 young boys, he remarried his firm's stenographer, Lillian Chusevich. She was the daughter of a man who had immigrated from Croatia, and they begot John Herndon Mercer. Music surrounded Johnny Mercer's childhood. In the evenings, he curled up in his father's lap to hear him sing In the Gloaming and other turn-of-the-century favorites. They played records on the gramophone of Gilbert and Sullivan operettas and Harry Lauder singing of the Hebrides. Tin Pan Alley tunes entered the house as sheet music to be played on the baby grand. When his Chusevich relatives with them, Johnny attended the vaudeville shows at the Keith Bijou and heard the black-faced comedians in Al G. Field's minstrels at the old Savannah Theater. He took piano lessons, but really studied music as a choir boy at the Episcopal Christ Church. And there he learned to read notes and mastered the harmonic construction of Anglican compositions by Isaac Watts, Charles Wesley, and Lowell Mason, the latter 2 having ties to the parish. Christ Church's circular nave once had the words, Hark the Herald, the angels sing, painted above the altar. perhaps a reference to Wesley's Christmas hymn, which might have inspired Johnny's song, And the Angels Sing, written with Benny Goodman in 1939. The liturgical heritage Mercer gained in the Episcopal Church prepared him for collaboration with similarly trained composers, such as Harold Arlen, the son of a cantor, prompting the poet and editor David Lehman to note, Mercer was not Jewish, but I like to think of him as an honorary Jew. In his household, African-American domestic workers sang spirituals, work songs, and lullabies in the presence of the boy who listened intently. His father owned Burnside Island, where the family stayed in the summers at Vernon View, facing the Atlantic Ocean. Johnny accompanied black playmates to the Sweet Field of Eden Baptist Church in Pinpoint, where he witnessed the black congregation's call and response in ring shouts, perhaps inspiring his Leaving Time chorus for the Broadway musical St. Louis Woman. Similarly, accentuate the positive might have come from Johnny's hearing Bishop Charles' Sweet Daddy Grace during his annual visits to Savannah's United House of Prayer for All People, where a gospel parade led the cult leader into the sanctuary. Johnny received his formal education at the Massey School in Savannah and Woodbury Forest School in Orange, Virginia, leaving there after 5 years in 1927 without a diploma, in part because of the failure of his father's real estate business, which had lost over $1 million following the collapse of the Florida land boom. Years later, after selling Capitol Records, Johnny would pay off the debts. Recognizing his son's desire to be an actor, G.A. Mercer financed Johnny's early years in New York City, where his son won bit parts in traveling shows staged by the Theater Guild. In 1930, he contributed the song Out of Breath and Scared to Death of You for the perennial Broadway revue, The Gaieties, directed by Richard Rodgers and Larry Hart. Not only did the T.B. Harms publish the song, but in the chorus danced a girl named Ginger Meehan, who became Johnny's wife of 45 years. A daughter, Mandy, and a son, Jeff, would round out the family. Other songs followed, but no real hit until Mercer partnered with Hoagie Carmichael on Lazy Bones. That song resulted in a 1933 contract with the most popular jazz band of the day, led by Paul Whiteman, with Johnny singing duets with the Texas trombonist Jack Teagarden. Then soon, Hollywood came calling. The initial Warner Brothers contract in 1936 that brought Johnny into the movie studios paired him up with Richard Dick Whiting, a veteran songwriter who mentored Mercer. Their song, Too Marvelous for Words, which we had heard earlier sung this morning by Betsy Riddlehouse Rutherford, reveals the wordsmith's struggle with writing. The verse opens, I search for phrases to sing your praises, but there aren't any magic adjectives to tell you all you are. Then Mercer goes on to list dozens of them. The reigning master of the great American song, jazz pianist Michael Feinstein, is particularly fond of this lyric, noting that when Mercer had trouble finding La Motte Juste, Whiting gave him a thesaurus. You're just too marvelous for words, like rapturous, fabulous. Your voice is tintinnabulous. It's all too wonderful. An ordinary word, like magical, mystical, seems just too apathetical. Or these adjectives, set to a tune by the jazz vibraphonist Lionel Hampton. Your lips were like a red and ruby chalice, warmer than the summer night. The clouds were like an alabaster palace, rising to a snowy height. Each star its own aurora borealis. Suddenly you held me tight, I could see the midnight sun. The examples underscore the advice Mercer gave to a young girl who once asked him, what does it take to be a lyric writer? Johnny responded, darling, read, read, read. That's what it takes. Read a lot. And don't just read love stories. Read the classics. Read about the Wild West. You must read, and you must look up the words that you're not familiar with, but read a lot, and then be inquisitive about the meaning of words. Johnny had an ear for the English language and loved wordplay. With that old black magic, he used both external and internal rhymes to make his point. For you're the lover I have waited for, the mate that fate kept me created for. This hit song brimmed with sexual energy. I hear your name, and I'm aflame. And in it, Mercer confessed his desire for his lover of 30 years, Judy Garland. while demonstrating why literature professor Philip Furia sees him as a poet of Tin Pan Alley. Mercer loved place names and used them for inspiration. The World War II propaganda picture, Here Come the Waves, about the women accepted for volunteer emergency service, turned on its head the old sailors saying about a woman in every port with the song, There's a Fella Waiting in Poughkeepsie, with its lyric, and a CB waiting in Milwaukee, and a guy in Hackensack, in Pontiac, Daytona, Pomona, and about every other town where the military had an installation that these women might visit. Over his 40 years in Hollywood, Mercer worked with almost all the great actors and actresses, directors and songwriters, the scriptwriters. He knew fellow Georgian Nunnally Johnson, contributed music to the Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall picture, To Have and Have Not, that William Faulkner scripted. In that film, collaborator Hoagie Carmichael played their song, How Little We Know, with the lyric, Who knows why an April breeze never remains? Why stars in the trees hide when it rains? Better known, of course, to us is the Carmichael-Mercer collaboration Skylark, with its lyrics, and in your lonely flight, haven't you heard the music in the night? Wonderful music, faint as a will-o'-the-wisp, crazy as a loon, sad as a gypsy, serenading the moon. With Capitol Records, Mercer collaborated with Disney Studios to produce recordings of the African folk tales written by fellow Georgia Writers Hall of Famer Joel Chandler Harris that Walt Disney produced in the movie form as Song of the South, but which Capitol released as Tales of Uncle Remus that included Mercer singing a positively infectious cover of Ray Gilbert and Allie Warble's song, Zippity-Doo-Dah. Margaret Whiting recalled, Mercer always said a song was like a one-act play. Exposition, development, then the big crisis and denouement. With One for My Baby and One More for the Road, Johnny tells a complete story with such empathy that the sad life of the self-mocking loser comes off as tragedy. I've got the routine, so drop another nickel in the machine. I'm feeling so bad, I wish you'd make the music dreamy and sad. Could tell you a lot, but that's not in a gentleman's code. Make it one for my baby and one more for the road. To this confession, Mercer adds, you'd never know it, but buddy, I'm a kind of poet, and I got a lot of things to say, and when I'm gloomy, you simply gotta listen to me until it's talked away. Fred Astaire introduced One for My Baby in the film The Sky's the Limit. The sometime Georgian Lena Horne debuted the song on the radio during a Jubilee broadcast over the U.S. Army's Armed Forces radio service. During the war, Mercer hosted his own radio show over NBC and the military station and regularly appeared on Command Performance USA, through which his music reached 1 billion people in 30 countries by 1942. With some lyrics, Johnny used clean strokes and bright colors to set the scene, as evident in the German song he adapted as Summer Wind. Like painted kites, the days and nights went flying by. The world was new beneath a blue umbrella sky. Sometimes just the hint of an image sufficed to get Mercer's ideas across. Both Irving Berlin and Cole Porter expressed to Mercer the wish they had written Laura, a song fashioned out of a movie theme song. To capture the mysterioso feeling, Mercer used words like watercolors. Laura is the face in the misty light, footsteps that you hear down the hall, the laugh that floats on a summer night that you can never quite recall. To date, there are at least 400 recordings of Laura. For one of Capitol's early pressings, Johnny recruited Paul Whiteman and Billie Holiday to record his lyric, Traveling Light. Already, Holiday had recorded Mercer's When a Woman Loves a Man, and in fact, when record agent John Hammond first discovered Lady Day, she was singing Johnny's song, Would Ya for a Big Red Apple? So impressed, Hammond brought her into the studio with Benny Goodman, Jack Teagarden, and other musicians, including the guitarist Dick McDonough, who contributed a tune to which Johnny added lyrics called Riffin' the Scotch, which became the first Billie Holiday recording. The song demonstrates Mercer's talent for capturing the vernacular while being prescient about the singer. I jumped out of the frying pan right into the fire when I lost me a cheating man and got a no-count liar. Years later, Mercer must have had Holiday in mind when writing Harlem Butterfly, with a lyric that borrowed from one of his favorite poets, Edna St. Vincent Millay. For even though a candle burned at both ends can never last out the night, Harlem Butterfly, it really makes a lovely light. When the Georgia General Assembly asked Johnny to write a new state song in 1965, he deferred to his friends Hoagie Carmichael and Stuart Gurrell's Georgia on My Mind. But the Solons insisted, so Johnny took lines from Stephen Vincent Benet's John Brown's Body. Oh, Georgia, Georgia, the careless yield, the watermelons ripe in the field, to which Mercer added 8 verses in a heartfelt but somewhat stodgy state song that the legislators declined in favor of the aforementioned jazz standard. Mercer had better luck adapting the ideas of Benet into his filmed musical, 7 Brides for 7 Brothers. Taking the words of the French surrealist poet Jacques Prévert, Mercer fashioned Autumn Leaves, using fewer words in the original while retaining the post-war sense of loss. The falling leaves drift by the window, the autumn leaves of red and gold. As the former lover recalls kissing the lips of the woman whose sunburned hands I used to hold, he fears the approach of old winter's song and pines for his lost love. But I miss you most of all, my darling, when autumn leaves start to fall. The now largely forgotten English Victorian poet Ernest Dowson inspired one of Mercer's most famous lyrics, as well as the title, by the way, of a certain Pulitzer Prize-winning novel by fellow Georgia Writers Hall of Famer Margaret Mitchell. Here, the movie's title, The Days of Wine and Roses, came from a Dowson poem that prompted with what Mercer's collaborator Henry Mancini liked to call one of Johnny's abstract lyrics. The days of wine and roses laugh and run away like a child at play through the meadowland towards a closing door, a door marked nevermore that wasn't there before. The lonely night discloses just a passing breeze filled with memories of the golden smile that introduced me to the days of wine and roses and you. What a summation of life and love in 2 brief sentences. Savannah jazzman Julius Boo Hornstein is surely correct when he links Tybreza, the wraparound veranda on Tybee Island where the most popular jazz bands had played during Johnny's youth, to Mercer's lyric for Early Autumn. When an early autumn walks the land and chills the breeze and touches with her hand the summer trees, perhaps you'll understand what memories I own. There's a dance pavilion in the rain, all shuttered down, a winding country lane, all russet brown. A frosty window pane shows me a town grown lonely. This sense of loss pervades many of Mercer's lyrics, often linked to an expression of place or the pangs of love. Yet other songs reflect a characteristic optimism filled with the American spirit, such as Moon River with its hopeful, "We're after the same rainbow's end, waiting round the bend, my huckleberry friend, Moon River and me." By the time Andy Williams sang this theme song from the movie Breakfast at Tiffany's on the 1962 Academy Awards ceremony, a worldwide audience of 90 million people watched the live broadcast over television. The president of the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers, on whose board Mercer once sat, recognized Johnny's global reputation by noting his Moon River is sung up the Volga and down the Danube, while other Mercer songs are sung in remote corners of the world by people who don't have the remotest idea of what an Academy Award is, but they know his songs, as do we all. How fitting then for Johnny Mercer to be the first lyricist inducted into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame.
covered it all. So I'll try to keep it simple. Me and my lovely cousin Nancy, Johnny's niece, are very honored to represent the Mercer family today. I get to do the talking, but Nancy grew up with Johnny, her Uncle Bubba. So if you have any real questions about Johnny, and she's a family historian, so please don't ask me. When Chantal mentioned to me at 9 o'clock last night that she'd like me to say a few words, I wanted to reflect on Johnny as a poet. And Glenn stole all the great lines there, but I think he was lobbying for his induction 60 plus years ago with one more for my baby and one more for the road when he said, you never know it, but buddy, I'm kind of a poet. And I have a lot of things to say. So I think now you guys made it official. He is a poet, and I think his close to 1,500 songs show that he certainly had a lot to say. You know, Johnny thought of himself, I think, as an average Joe, and that was, you know, he used that word a lot. And I think that helped him relate to the masses through 6 decades of writing in the 20th century. So I think he really could connect with the people. He kept it thoughtful and simple and from the heart, and I think that helped. Although he worked real hard to keep it simple, as many of the writers know here. You know, the Mercer family would really like to thank the University of Georgia Libraries, the administration here, and also the voting committee to see fit to put Johnny in with the great writers, the great American writers of today and today's inductees. I think he would be extremely humbled by that. And I don't know if he'd basically say, I don't know if I belong here, but I'll stick around and eat the free Danishes. So that's, you know, more Johnny's style. I think when scholars and educators come up to me, they always really want to tell me what a great writer Johnny was and how technical he was, and it'd really break it down for me. They'd say how he commented on the era of his times, you know, with songs like G.I. Jive and Hooray for Hollywood. He would, you know, ponder the changes of the seasons with many of his songs. He always thought about remembering loved ones, you know, and the angels sing, I remember you. So he really just tried to connect with everybody in the eras that he represented. It reminded me one time of Mel Torme. I met him about 20 years ago, and he cornered me at a club in New York, and he was insistent that I have to understand what a brilliant writer Johnny was. And he spent about an hour breaking down the Midnight Sun, and he said anybody that could figure out how to put Ruby Chalice, Alabaster Palace, and Aurora Borealis into the same song had to be a total genius. And you know, he was a big fan of Johnny's, but you know, I don't know how brilliant or what kind of genius he was, but I can really tell you he was a really great guy, a really nice guy, and we miss him very, very much. And I certainly think he would be incredibly honored to be inducted today. So that's about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now to induct University of Georgia alumna and Pulitzer Prize winner, Natasha Trethewey, is Dr. Jamil Zinaldin, President of the Georgia Humanities Council.
Would like to introduce Professor Brett Gadsden from Emory, who is also here with his wife, Natasha Trethewey. Natasha Trethewey was born in 1966 in Gulfport, Mississippi, where she lived before moving to Decatur, Georgia, with her mother. During her childhood, she was a frequent visitor to her mother's and grandmother's home in North Gulfport, an historic African-American community separated from the coast by some buildings, a ribbon of highway, and a few miles of flat red land. Her father is the poet Eric Trethewey, who for a time lived in New Orleans and with whom she also spent her summers. Professor Trethewey attended the University of Georgia and graduated in 1989 with a major in English. She received graduate degrees from Hollins University, where she studied with her father, who was on the faculty there, and the University of Massachusetts. Natasha Trethewey's life is not unlike a highway map of the South laid next to a map of the rest of North America, their roads finally intersecting in the 21st century present. Born of an African-American mother and a white Canadian father in a time when mixed marriages were illegal in half the states, Natasha Trethewey can claim Gulfport, New Orleans, and Atlanta as spiritual homes, so to speak. With a powerful sense of place and of her own biracial identity, her poetry refracts the stories, real and imagined, of solitary individuals of the American South that are also part of the composite story of the nation, a story that the United States and the South now seems ready to hear. She has known tragedy, she has seen and experienced calamity, and can report from the very heart of it. She knows what survival means too, and for her, poetry becomes an essential tool of healing. She is fully qualified to speak for those whose history has left silent. And speak for them she does. Her poems are like anonymous dispatches from a southern past, waiting to be opened by the reader. They are evocations of another time, another place. Stories told hauntingly through the sustained contemplation of a single aged photograph in which bales of cotton and American flags, black children in freshly starched clothes, and the image of an American president merge. Or a clouded childhood memory of a mother's bruises hidden by makeup, or the preserved Civil War era fortress on Ship Island, where the hopes and dreams of the African American Native Guard, the first black soldiers mustered into the Union Army, swelled for a time and was then forgotten. When you think of Natasha Trethewey's poetry, think of elegy. Think of the act of surfacing stories hidden from plain view, hidden perhaps by a conspiracy of society to forget. We are very good at that. Think of searching for a mother's unmarked grave in a cemetery obliterated by time and a hurricane and circumstances of neglect. Or gaze upon the wistful face in a posed 1912 photograph of a Storyville prostitute and wonder what she yearned for behind that distant stare and furrowed brow. What was her dream? Think of anonymous black laundresses and elevator operators and farm and city laborers of another time who were consigned to a work not exactly of their choosing, but in which the self of their own making still shone, where there was grace in the diligence of doing what needed to be done. This too is Professor Trethewey's poetry. And not surprising, she sees this work as her civic duty. No doubt as did Walt Whitman, Flannery O'Connor, W.E.B. Du Bois, Lillian Smith, and Frederick Douglass. Stories close the distances between us. Stories become the means by which we at last see each other in the light of recognition. If this, in fact, is so, then the unfettered stories told by poets are the hope of democracy everywhere. Sacrifice, endurance, duty, work, loss, courage, hope. These shimmer in Professor Trethewey's poetic imagination of remembrance, and therein is their power to connect us. Natasha Trethewey is the author of several published collections of poems. These include Domestic Work, published in 2000, Balak's Ophelia, published in 2002, and Native Guard, published in 2006. Her most recent work is a meditation on the Mississippi Gulf Coast beyond Katrina, published this year by the University of Georgia Press. Her poetic voice is widely praised and has been called by one critic a new stage in our national poetry. Another has described her work as a small body of nearly flawless poetry through which she is forming a singular art from a mixed racial experience without sacrificing either heritage. She is a recipient of many poetry prizes and recognitions, and in 2007 she won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry for her collection of poems in native garb, the first University of Georgia graduate to do so outside the field of journalism. She holds the Phyllis Wheatley Distinguished Chair in Poetry at Emory University, where she also teaches creative writing. It is a great honor on behalf of the board to induct Natasha Trethewey into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much. This is indeed an honor, particularly because the University of Georgia is my alma mater. And when I began school here in the mid-'80s, I never thought I'd be coming back for such an honor. Nor did I know that I was becoming a writer. But as I look back on it now, I realize that things that happened to me here set me on the path for being the writer that I am today. And I thought, in order to say thank you, I wanted to talk just briefly about two professors here who made all the difference in my life. The first is Dr. Rosemary Franklin. Both of the professors are emeritus professors now. The other is Dr. Charlie Wines. I took several classes with Dr. Franklin, but it was in her Women in Literature class that I first read poems, even though my father and stepmother are both poets, and I knew the stories that their poems were telling. It was in Dr. Franklin's Women in Literature class that I first read poems that invited me in and allowed me to see myself, and I was hooked. So I kept going back to Dr. Franklin's classes, and as a senior, took her realism and naturalism class. Because I'd been with her for a while, I think, she entrusted me as a kind of research assistant. And so I got to see her not just as a professor, but also as a scholar. And doing the research that she sent me to the library to do was thrilling. And I think that that was the moment of inculcating in me this idea of research that would always form the basis of my poems. In my freshman year, I met Dr. Charlie Wines. I enrolled in the spring quarter in his American history class. And on the first day of class, I was charmed because he called us all Mr. and Miss. And I thought, well, now I feel like I'm in some learned halls, and this is how we should refer to each other. On that first day of class, he handed out note cards and asked us to write down our hometowns. Now, you know, this is 1985, and so it was long before the internet, which makes this even more impressive, that the next day he introduced all of us to each other in the class by telling a little bit of the history of our hometowns. And as I sat there listening, I couldn't believe that this history professor at the University of Georgia knew so much about this little place in Mississippi that I'd come from. But listening to it, what I realized is that I had a particular geography. I had a history to which I was indebted, that I had come from. And it set me on this path of trying to write in such a way that I could always mine the intersections of personal and public history, that my story could illuminate a public history in the same way that a public history helped me understand my own personal story. And so, even though I did not know I was going to be a writer, I told somebody yesterday that if I thought I was going to be in the Hall of Fame here for anything, it was going to be as the first black captain of cheerleading. So it's really meaningful instead that I am here and so deeply honored by this place that began making me the writer that I am. Thank you.
And now to induct Melissa Fay Green, Professor Insco. There he is. All right. Thank you.
My profuse apologies for my delay in getting here, and I apologize especially to Melissa and even more so to her children for having to wait and see their mother move to the back of the line. It is a real privilege for me to introduce Melissa Fay Green to you today and to welcome her into what I think is this year's especially distinguished group of inductees into the Hall of Fame. Melissa, a Macon native and longtime Decatur resident, would merit entry into the Hall of Fame even if she, like Margaret Mitchell, had only written one book, her first, Praying for Sheetrock, published in 1991. But of course, she's much more than a one-book wonder. Still, Praying for Sheetrock has long been a classic of Georgia history and a model of creative nonfiction. It's the story of how only in the 1970s, the civil rights movement found its way to a relatively small, remote, rural community on the Georgia coast, McIntosh County. It's a very human drama, with an unlikely protagonist and a black resident named Thurnell Alston, a flawed but tremendously appealing character who takes on a shrewd and powerful antagonist, longtime Sheriff Tom Popple. A single racial encounter on the streets of Darien in 1972 triggered a chain of events that eventually overturned a well-entrenched political and economic caste system that had remained undeterred and unchallenged by the seismic shift that had played out elsewhere a decade or more earlier in what we think of as the official history of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and early 60s. As Green writes in her foreword, this is a chronicle of large and important things happening in a very small place. It is about the end of the good old boy era and the rise of civil rights, and what that famous epic looked like, sounded like, smelled like, and felt like in a Georgia backwater in the 1970s. To see how that happened, she wrote, one must drop down to the level of the sidewalks, kitchens, and backyards. What were people saying? Who was saying what? How did their histories, biases, and perceptions inspire them? And why did an epoch of social change play differently here than in New York, or Detroit, Atlanta, or Memphis, or even the small county up the road? This is an immensely humanistic approach to history. Green's great skill as an observer, a researcher, and a writer that makes this book so special. Much of it comes from the fact that she knew much of this story and its characters firsthand. In fact, her husband, Don Samuel, was a key player in the legal challenge mounted by Alston and the black community there. A number of us assign Praying for Sheetrock regularly in our history courses here at UGA, and our fellow history teachers throughout the state do as well. It is, in fact, the only book that I assign to my courses in Georgia history, courses in Southern history, and to the large U.S. survey as we teach it here with 300 students, mostly in this building now. We're selling a lot of books. Much of the task we face in those large surveys is to sell history to those students, in many cases, to undo the damage done by cut and dried way in which so many high school history classes are still taught. And I know of no better way of winning those freshmen over, of re-energizing an interest in and attraction to the past, to their past, than to have them read the sort of history that Melissa Fay Green writes. Praying for Sheetrock won a number of major book awards, and Melissa followed it with a second book that's equally rich. There's no sophomore slump for her. It centers on a far more complex and far more visible incident in Georgia's civil rights history, the bombing of the Temple in Atlanta in 1958. She uses that bombing as a focal point through which to tell not only about the role of Southern Jews in the civil rights movement, but also about the entangled world of Atlanta politics, both black and white, during those turbulent years. And she does so quite adeptly by focusing her lens on yet another intriguing, multifaceted, and unsung hero of that struggle for racial justice, Rabbi Jacob Rothschild, as he and his congregation had to contend with the implications of what this violent affront did to their assumed and hard-fought-for status as part of the city's social elite. One critic called the book historical writing at its finest, compassionate, literary, thorough, and utterly riveting. And I'm sure I'd be assigning it to undergraduates as well if it weren't so dang long. I do assign the book's prologue to many classes. I know that seems like a cop-out, but it's a great prologue. And really sets it up, so many of those things well. Melissa has moved well beyond Georgia in her two most recent books, Last Man Standing in 2003, the story of a wrenching coal mining disaster in Nova Scotia, also in 1958, and it does happen to have a very curious Georgia connection to it. And then There Is No Me Without You in 2006, an impassioned portrait of an Ethiopian woman who took on the great challenge of dealing with hundreds of orphans created by the AIDS epidemic there. This is a very personal story for Green, who with Don Samuel adopted 4 of those Ethiopian orphans themselves. She's just completed a memoir in which she recounts the experience of presiding over a household of 9 children, 4 of their own, and the 5 who are here with us today who represent that second generation of adoptees. Titled No Biking in the House, ... without a helmet there. It will be out in a couple of weeks, and it's already getting glowing pre-publication reviews. Melissa has a wonderful sense of humor, and by all accounts, this book is going to allow that to shine through in ways that her earlier subjects have not always lent themselves to. There's humor in every one of her books. It's never absent. Melissa made a profound statement at the beginning of Praying for Sheetrock. After the fact, she wrote, historians may look back upon a season when 1,000 lives, 100,000 lives moved in unison. But in the beginning, there were really only individuals acting in isolation and uncertainty, out of necessity or idealism, unaware that they are living through an epoch. While a very apt description of what Thurnell Austin experienced in McIntosh County, it's an equally fitting description of the stories Melissa has told in her subsequent work as well. For all of them focus on individuals, on giving voice to voices that haven't been heard, as so much of Natasha's work has done as well. Green's histories center on the genuine heroes and heroines, and her portraits of each of them are so compelling because of the challenging, often hostile societies, communities, and mores through which their heroism has had to play out. And it's her skill as a writer that makes these worlds and those characters so engaging, so vivid, so memorable. In his article on Melissa in the New Georgia Encyclopedia, Hugh Ruppersberg summed up what makes her writing so special. Green's vivid prose style, understanding of the complexity of human character and historical event, sense of drama, and moral convictions enabled her to write works of nonfiction that have all the virtues of the best literature. This is why it is so fitting that Melissa Fay Green is at long last being inducted into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame, while we recognize all of her work, which should be read and appreciated as fully as Praying for Sheetrock has been for so long, and while we all welcome her inclusion so enthusiastically.
Don't be alarmed by the notebook. I know everyone's hungry. Dr. Insko, Dr. Potter, Dr. Graham, and Hall of Fame judges, thank you so much for inviting me here today. Let me quickly introduce my family. My husband, Don Samuel, is probably going out for coffee. No, he's there.
Strong stuff.
Our children, Joseph Samuel, who's in 7th grade. You can sit. Saul is a 10th grader, Helen 8th grade, Jesse 9th, Daniel 10th. And we have 4 older children, Molly and Seth both live in San Francisco, work in public radio. Lee is a college senior in Israel, and Lily is a college freshman at Oberlin. Thank you especially for giving me an honor that my children can appreciate. I mean, they see the Robert F. Kennedy Book Prize sitting in my office, but I believe they suspect he must have played for the Red Sox. And the National Book Critics Circle is a team they've never even heard of. Molly, our oldest, asked, are you now going to be referred to as Hall of Famer Melissa Fay Green? My son Lee asked, does this make your rookie card more valuable? And just this morning, my husband said, you know, this is not my first Hall of Fame induction. I've been to Cooperstown. I was the first person in my family to graduate from college, but my mother, a shy girl from Macon, did attend just 1 semester of college before dropping out to marry my father, and that 1 semester was here, I guess in 1947. The only class she ever told us about, her only college class we heard about, was archery. And she spoke about it because here, her very first week living independently of her mother, she had to make her first purchase by herself using her brand new first ever checkbook. And what she was required to buy was a dozen arrows for archery class. For the rest of her life, she remembered that the arrows had cost 72 cents and that she had written a check for them. I have not had many regrets in life. I've been very lucky. But I have had one regret that I've carried with me for 32 years, and that regret has been that on April 16, 1979, the day after Don and I married in Savannah, I moved here to join him on a rental house in Springdale. He was then in his second year of law school. I don't regret moving to Athens. I loved it here. We were happy here. I regret that it didn't occur to me to apply to UGA to earn a master's degree in American history. I was writing by then. I was starting to publish magazine articles. But with every sentence I wrote, I felt the presence of deeper knowledge and vital insights, a broader grasp of the material. I was writing profiles of contemporary people, but I felt stirring behind them the history of the Georgia coast, the history of America. When I stepped foot in UGA's little library, the large library, for the first time, I felt the same way I felt when I entered Notre Dame in Paris a few years earlier. I felt awe. I felt that I was in the presence of greatness. I felt what archaeologists must have felt when they uncovered the Library of Alexandria. Of course, these days, the internet gives all of us access to the world's intellectual, cultural, artistic treasures at the touch of a button on a device we carry in our pockets. But in 1980, when I moved here and wandered through those stacks, it seemed to me there must be few places in the world where so much of humanity's knowledge was stored. I ran home and told my husband, you can look up all the footnotes in a book, and all those books are here. And you can look up all the footnotes in those books, and those books are all here. And you can look up the footnotes in those books, and they've even got all of those. By then, he had, with a polite smile, returned to studying torts. It didn't occur to me when we lived here to apply to graduate studies in history. It was only after we left, moving first to Rome, Georgia, then to Atlanta, that I realized the opportunity that had escaped me. It was later that I wished I had become, in my 2 years here, something other than a law student's wife and a part-time employee at the Clark County Public Library. I wished that I'd learned to really navigate that cathedral of knowledge. Not having a degree in history has meant for me not knowing when to stop, never really knowing when I had researched enough. When writing Praying for Sheetrock, I didn't know how far back to go to investigate the political, social, and racial underpinnings of McIntosh County in the 70s. Obviously, I needed the whole 20th century to build to that point, and the whole 19th century too, and why not the 18th? And the 17th century looked pretty good, and the 16th century must have been lovely on the Georgia coast in the spring. Before I was finished, I had blundered backwards in time to the Pleistocene era. In an early draft, I had that giant 3,000-pound ground sloth that roamed coastal Georgia 14,000 years ago. He was sacrificed in the editing process. My editor secretly deleted him, but I struck back when describing coastal route US 17 by including this lumber truck, quote, a brontosaur-like lumber truck, erupted from a side road and brainlessly sashayed down the central line. But then I ran into trouble with the 19th century. In writing about the rural African-American community of McIntosh County, I spent something like 70 pages on Reconstruction. It was the most solid treatment of Reconstruction I had ever seen up to that point, and I'm still proud of it. My editor argued against it. Reconstruction has nothing to do with this story, Melissa, she said. Reconstruction has everything to do with this story, I told her, and Reconstruction stayed alive in the pages of Praying for Sheetrock a little bit longer. But then came the Tuesday afternoon massacre. My editor called, Melissa, pages 212 to 324, get rid of them. But Jane, I wept, if they don't read about Reconstruction, no one will understand the end of the book. Melissa, she snarled, if people read about Reconstruction, no one will make it to the end of the book. Lose it. In every one of the books published so far, I had a different editor, by the way, for Temple Bombing, which is why it's too long and you can't teach it to your classes. Talk to me about a revised edition. In all of my books, there's a trace of the Paleolithic, just the mildest breath of the crustacean, because I didn't have a degree in history from UGA and I didn't know enough to stop. I have another memory of this campus, of this library system, and that concerns the Georgia Review. Soon after moving to town in April 1979, I wrote a book review and I submitted it to the Georgia Review. Of course, submissions to a serious magazine were supposed to take place through the mail. These days, of course, it all takes place online, but back then you had to type up your submission, type up a nice-looking cover letter, enclose a self-addressed stamped envelope so the magazine could reject your work with ease, and mail it in. But I lived nearby. We lived right over on Springdale Street, so I walked it over. I just knocked on the door of the Georgia Review one day, walked in, and handed my book review to the receptionist. It wasn't even in an envelope. She was startled. She'd never had a piece of work submitted by hand. "Oh, I live just up the hill," I said. And she nodded soberly, but with a look of concern that suggested this was not how it was done, and whatever this was I was handing was not going to be accepted for publication by the editors. It was published that winter a few months later, and here it is. So thank you for validating my work. I thank you deeply for expressing with this tremendous honor your respect for the research that I have done and for the yet more extensive research I have done when I didn't know when to stop. One of the greatest people I ever interviewed was an old-time left-wing labor lawyer in Atlanta named Joe Jacobs. He gets a whole chapter to himself in the Temple Bombing. John, you haven't read that far, but it's a nice chapter. Just because it has nothing to do with the storyline, just because I admire the man. He died a few years ago, but I know just what he would have said to me on this occasion. He would have said, "Melissa, you in high cotton now." Thank you.
Just in closing, I'd like to thank everyone for being with us. Thank you for your support of the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame events. And let's give our inductees one more round of applause. Thank you.